Thank you very much, and welcome everybody to the second of 3 webinars on the hospitality apprenticeship reform. So today we're going to be looking at on-programme delivery and assessment, and the content we're going to be going through is looking at the register of apprenticeship training providers, the off-the-job training requirement, options for on-programme delivery and assessment, Pearson resources to support on-programme delivery, and starting to look at next week's session, which is next Friday, the 25th of May, for any of you that is interested, looking at preparation for endpoint assessment. Very much. So, first on the agendas for today, register of apprenticeship training providers, RATP, ROATP, depending on how you want to pronounce it or shorten it. So what is this? Most of you will be aware of the Register of Training Organisations, which is an SFA managed list of providers that are approved to deliver training, not just apprenticeship training, but adult skills budget and 16 to 18 training as well. Obviously, the ESFA, as they're now known, has brought in a new register specifically for the delivery of apprenticeships, and this became applicable as of the 1st of May. So any providers from the 1st of May that want to deliver apprenticeships going forward ideally need to be registered on, or need to be a member of this register. And that is to deliver both levy funded provision and also co-funded provision, so employer funded provision alongside it. So either way, you'd need to be on the register. There is a caveat to that. If you are going to be delivering less than £100,000 worth of apprenticeship business per year, that's per contract year, as a subcontractor, then you don't have to be on the register. What I will say to you is, if that's your situation at the moment, that only relates to 20 retail learners per year doing a level 2 or level 3 retail programme, or any apprentice delivering on a £5,000 per learner programme. That only equates to 20 learners a year. So if you deliver more than 20 learners a year on anything that's above £5,000 per learner, and it's a 12-month programme, then you may need to consider applying on the register when it opens again. So there are 3 types of application that you can make to be on the register. So the first is an employer provider, which traditionally are your employers that have had a direct contract with the SFA in the past for apprenticeship provision, and they are looking to continue that lead provider status because they are the main delivery element of their apprenticeship provision. The second type of application is a lead provider. So this is somebody who currently may have a direct contract with the Skills Funding Agency for apprenticeship provision, and also between either themselves or the employer provider, depending on which one they are, will be delivering at least 50% of the overall apprenticeship delivery. And you then have a supporting provider role, which, as I said in the bullet point below, is either a specialist provider or a subcontracted provider that delivers less than £500,000 per annum, which does sound a lot, but like I said earlier, for £100,000 you get 20 learners. So you're looking at about 100 learners for £500,000, which again, looking at your own contracts of what you currently deliver, and if it's across a range of occupations, you may need to consider whether or not you go on as a subcontractor or a supporting provider or a lead provider going forwards. If you have any employer that comes to you that wants to work with you directly, you will need to be a lead provider in order to work with them. If you're not a lead provider and down as a supporting provider, or you're not on the register at all, you will have to go via a lead provider in order to be able to access the funding. So the register was opened earlier on this year, and the first applicants were approved in around March. There was about 1,700 applicants approved on the register in a mixture of those 3 types of application, more employer providers than I think was initially expected. And the register then opened again at the end of March and closed at the beginning of April for providers that were new entrants to the list, or those that were rejected in the first round and have reapplied in the second round. The register, I believe, opens again in June. However, with the general election and the government going into purdah, We're not sure when the announcements of the March-April submissions will be announced, whether it would be before the election or after the election, and we're unsure as to when the register will reopen in June. The initial date I think given was the 9th of June, which is the day after the election. I'm assuming, depending on the outcome of the election, will be whether the register opens on that date. And likewise, if the government, if the skills funding or the Education and Skills Funding Agency have got approval from the Minister and the Parliament to continue working on this activity during PERDA, then they may have had an exemption provided. I know that the Institute for Apprenticeships have had an exemption provided for them to continue working on approving assessment plans and standards, so they are able to continue to do that during the PERDA period. But I'm not sure from the Education and Skills Funding Agency whether they've had the approval to carry on with the register of training providers. We are trying to find that information out at the moment. So, off-the-job delivery. Now, obviously, on-programme delivery and assessment is a key component of an apprenticeship going forward. And for those of you that were on the webinar last week, you'll hear me mention how important off-the-job training and delivery is as part of the overall apprenticeship programme. So there is a minimum that 20% of delivery must be delivered off the job, and this is a delivery, 20% of delivery across the entire apprenticeship programme. So whether that be a 12-month apprenticeship programme, an 18-month apprenticeship programme, or even a 2 to 3 year apprenticeship programme, 20% of the overall time of apprenticeships must be delivered as off-the-job training. So this is classified as not being in the apprentice's normal day-to-day working environment and not delivered as part of normal working activities. So from a hospitality perspective, it can't be delivered in the kitchen that the candidate is normally employed in if it's a catering type role, or if it's from a hospitality perspective, if they are a barista, then again it can't be on the shop floor in that shop behind the counter. The Education and Skills Funding Agency guidelines state that it must be outside of normal day-to-day working environment and not delivered as part of normal working duties, and it must be during normal working hours. Again, from a hospitality perspective, that can be quite flexible because, again, hospitality apprentices tend to work relatively flexible shifts, but it has to be during their schedule. It must be during their contracted hours. So if, for example, they're on a split shift, then any time in between that split shift that they undertake training will not be considered as off the job unless they are being paid during that split shift period. So, off-the-job training, it can consist of teaching theory, so things to do with food hygiene or the theory of customer service, communication techniques, for example. It could be practical training, so looking at a specific culinary activity such as preparing vegetables, or from a housekeeping perspective, the safe use of working with chemicals. Likewise, it can also be using learning support and writing assignments or assessments. Again, if there are some work that is carried out that is written as part of the on-programme delivery and assessment, then the time that's spent with you in a workshop or a seminar type format can be used as long as I said, it is during their normal working hours. So off-the-job training doesn't include English and Maths delivery where necessary, because this is funded outside of the apprenticeship and the guided learning hours for that are counted outside of the apprenticeship. It also can't be used for progress reviews or on-programme assessment. So current SACE apprentices that are going through a SACE framework often have on-programme assessment or observations in the workplace from an MVQ perspective. These cannot be classified as off the job because they are normally, although within their candidates' working hours, it's normally in their general working environment. The other thing to remember as well is this goes not just for off the job but on the job delivery as well, that you cannot use apprenticeship funding for any on the job training or off the job training that is delivered solely by distance learning. So if you're an organisation that relies a lot on distance learning to carry out your theoretical delivery or your underpinning knowledge delivery, you will need to consider a blended approach to learning in order to retain your funding for the delivery of this apprenticeship. So how do you schedule this off-the-job delivery? Well, for those of you that dialed in last week, the contract between yourself and the employer is critical, and within that contract you should be outlining your schedule of off-the-job and on-the-job delivery elements. If an employer is not prepared to release an apprentice for the off-the-job training requirements, I would strongly recommend that you do not sign the apprentice up. Again, if you do sign them up and they are not released for their 20% off the job, you could lose your funding from the ESFA, and then you would have to try and recover your costs from the employer, which is likely to be unforthcoming. Now, you can include in that off-the-job delivery, which again is as part of your discussion with that employer, are any internal training sessions that employer requires that employee, which is what an apprentice is, needs to complete as part of their work and contract with that employer. So it could include things like an induction program, first aid, food hygiene, anything that can actually be mapped to the requirements of the standard can be used to be part of that employee's off-the-job training requirement. As I said, as long as they are being released from work during their normal working hours to complete that training. In terms of the 20% requirement, if we have a standard 12-month apprenticeship program, which is 12 months of on-program delivery and assessment, because remember, endpoint assessment cannot start until after 12 months and 1 day has passed. So normally you would carry out a gateway process at the end of the 12 months, usually on 12 months and 1 day if they are ready at that point, possibly even after that. So if you assume that's 48 weeks to allow for a candidate's holidays, you're looking at approximately 9.5 weeks of off-the-job training across that 12-month period, which works out at 66 days. Which, if you're averaging, say, 6 hours a day for a day release program at a provider or a college, that's around just under 400 hours of delivery that you would need to schedule in. And this is applicable at every level. So if we have an apprentice that does hospitality team member and completes that and then progresses onto the hospitality supervisor, they will still need to do a further 20% of off-the-job training within that apprenticeship period. The 20% doesn't keep rolling on. Obviously, if it's a 3-year program, then it would be 9.5 weeks times 3, because it's 20% of the entire length of the program. So that is something to bear in mind. Now, obviously, you may need to schedule in some on-the-job training as well. You may not be able to get it all in the 20% off the job. And there is an expectation that some of that time will be spent as on-the-job training. However, that may be delivered by the employer as happens now. What I have next is we're moving on to options for on-program delivery and assessment. So as the poll suggested, if you're looking at delivering a qualification, now in hospitality there aren't any mandated qualifications listed, so funding isn't available for delivery of qualifications. Funding is available for delivery of underpinning knowledge and training to meet the requirements of a qualification, but it's not available to fund the registration and or certification costs of a qualification within an apprenticeship standard that isn't mandated. So for hospitality, yes, you can deliver a qualification if you so wish, but you won't be able to use the apprenticeship funding to pay for the registration and certification fee. That will either have to be paid for by the employer or offered as a bonus or freebie, if you like, to your customers, something that you tie into your profit and loss accounts and your costings when you're working out how much it costs to deliver, if you can absorb the cost of the registration fee into your overarching costs. So you can, for on-program, obviously the word classroom-based delivery of knowledge and theory requirements, classroom in inverted commas, because I appreciate not all learning is done in a classroom, but an environment where learners are together in groups or cohorts learning as a group, be it in a classroom in a provider or in a training room or a refreshment room somewhere within an organisation. We've also got the options for workshops or simulated environments for practical delivery. So if you're one of those organisations that are lucky to have a kitchen in your provider environment, then you can obviously deliver training sessions in that kitchen, which will also class as on programme. So as I said earlier, funding isn't available for purely online delivery, but a blended approach is appropriate, so a mix of online and offline sessions. I also mentioned the phrase here as flipped learning sessions. Now, I'm not sure if many of you have come across this concept before. It's something that's been that's growing in use in America and is becoming relatively common over here, in the fact that a flipped learning session is prior to a classroom session or a seminar or a workshop, the candidate is sent materials to review, read, research, and potentially write up questions about. So it could be about the appropriate temperatures for the storage of certain food products, for example. There could be a distance learning, so an online learning module that they can watch. There could be YouTube videos, there could be workbooks, textbooks they need to read, there could be other materials they need to read, there could be a research project that they need to go away and find materials out with. Once they've done that, they come along to the scheduled session prepared to not receive the information but to discuss the information with the tutor and with their colleagues. So it flips the whole concept of learning on its head. It's not about the tutor providing the knowledge. It's about the learners finding the knowledge out for themselves and coming along to the session, thinking about, the questions that they would like answering or the discussion points they would like to raise. So it is proving quite popular, more at a higher level, it is to be said, but I know from a sixth form perspective, many learners are looking at this, many colleges and providers are looking at this as an option going forwards, especially with limitations on resources. It makes life a little easier if you can get the learners to do some of the work beforehand. An alternative option for on-programme delivery obviously is also work shadowing. So if your apprentices are employed in a chain or an organisation that has a number of different locations, again, that learner can go and work in a different location, office, kitchen, wherever. It's their normal place of work, as long as it's carried out during normal working hours. Again, this could be constituted as off the job because it's not part of their normal day-to-day work environment, but they could carry out some elements of training and shadowing of colleagues in other areas. You will need to, as I said a couple of slides ago, plan out your sessions both on the job and off the job. And you could use a qualification to assist in this. The one thing I will say is we're currently mapping existing qualifications to the standards. You may not have a qualification that provides a full map to the standards because these standards are significantly broader than existing standards. And where you may have only had to do, for example, 6 units of a qualification to achieve the qualification previously, you may need to do all units of the qualification going forward to cover the breadth of the skills, knowledge and behaviours required as stipulated in the assessment plan. So in terms of your on-programme delivery and assessment, your first and end point should always be the assessment plan and the employer's occupational brief, which outlines the requirements for those occupations in terms of what you need to be able to deliver to the candidates so they know and understand and be able to demonstrate competently on an ongoing, continuous basis in order to be deemed competent to progress on to endpoint assessment. So in terms of creating schemes of work, delivery plans, you do need to ensure that all elements of the assessment plan are covered. For a learner, there may be an element of prior learning that they may not require the full amount of training being delivered. If that is the case, then the government will not expect the full amount of funding to be needed, but they will expect a 12-month minimum requirement to still be met. So there are plenty of options for on-program, but as I said earlier, it is critical that 20% off the job is met and delivered, and there will be documents that you will need to complete that are set out by People First, who are the external quality assurance organisation, that will ask for off-the-job training delivery or on-the-job training delivery to be recorded. And again, as part of Ofsted, they'll be asking to see lessons, plans and schemes of work. And from an Education and Skills Funding Agency perspective, again, they will be asking for a plan of delivery and obviously evidence that the delivery has taken place and that it was off the job. So better to be safe than sorry. If the employer does not want to release or is not prepared to release or signs to say they will and then they won't, you need to raise this as a concern immediately with your Education and Skills Funding Agency contract manager or lead provider and recommend that apprenticeship delivery is halted until off-the-job training can recommence. So, on-programme resources. What do we have? What do we need to do? So we currently have obviously apprenticeship workbooks and assessment activities. I appreciate these aren't as detailed as you would potentially like them to be, and they are there to develop. They were developed against the SACE apprenticeships. The content will still be relevant for the apprenticeship standards. Again, it just means that you may need to do more rather than the minimum requirements. We will have an apprenticeship, we'll have a new system called Pearson Apprentice 360 available at some point this year. We're in the testing stages at the moment, which is an online learning package where learners can select modules and complete online learning modules against specific content. Retail and hospitality are two of the sectors that have been prioritised for this, along with customer services and adult social care. And like I said, they will be available as part of a blended delivery package for you to support your off-the-job and on-the-job training activities. As I mentioned in the last slide, we will have qualifications, knowledge and competence that you can use. You can use the content to fund the delivery. Again, we're mapping the qualifications to the standards, so you can use that mapping document to confirm that that qualification does meet the standard requirements. But again, you can't fund the registration and certification costs out of the apprenticeship funding. We will also have preparation for endpoint assessment guidance, which is practice tests for the knowledge component, guides for observations and professional discussions. I will come on to the endpoint assessment materials briefly in a moment, and I will also cover them in more detail in the next session next week. We are looking at potentially creating sample schemes of work and lesson plans for particular elements of apprenticeships where they can be mapped and where there is content required. We are looking at having these available, but again, they're not available just yet, and we would need to know the level of demand for these schemes of work. So, preparation for endpoint assessment, final slide. We are creating some endpoint assessment materials that are generic endpoint assessment materials across a number of sectors. So observations and professional discussions about preparing a learner for both of those. Existing SACE learners obviously are aware of professional discussions and observations because they will have them continuously throughout their MVQ and technical certificate delivery process. For an apprenticeship standards learner, then observation and professional discussion may not be a common approach to delivery. You may decide that you don't need to do observations. There may be another way that you decide to assess on programme to ensure occupational competence, but we will have those guides available. Before a candidate can progress to endpoint assessment, there has to be a gateway process. And this gateway process is a meeting between the training provider, the employer and the apprentice as a minimum to confirm that the candidate is occupationally competent and that the employer is happy that the candidate is occupationally competent and the training provider is happy that the candidate is going to have a strong chance of success at passing the endpoint assessment. Endpoint assessment is a costly part of an apprenticeship programme that hasn't been there before. And if a candidate fails the endpoint assessment, there is only one resit opportunity, but that will come at a cost. And that cost is likely, although not yet confirmed, to be a similar price to the individual components of the endpoint assessment. So it needs to be something, because the employer may have to pay for this on top of the delivery of the apprenticeship. So, for example, if the standard is worth £5,000, it may cost £5,000 to deliver the on-programme delivery and assessment element and the initial endpoint assessment activity. If that candidate then fails the endpoint assessment activity, the funding cap has been reached. So the employer or the training provider is going to have to meet the cost of the resit, and that is something that you will be negotiating as part of your initial contract that is signed at the beginning of the apprenticeship. The gateway approach will also confirm the candidate has passed or met the maths and English requirements. So for a level 2 apprentice, that they have achieved a level 1 maths and English and ideally sat but not necessarily passed a level 2 maths and English test. And for those apprentices at level 3 and above, that they have achieved a level 2 maths and English qualification, either GCSE or A-level or functional skills, apologies. You will also discuss the timelines for endpoint assessment at this point. Now, you may have already booked a candidate in for endpoint assessment. You will need to book them in advance for endpoint assessment activities because of the timescales and the requirements, and also you will need to book them in for, from a hospitality perspective, an initial planning meeting. So again, these timescales will need to be discussed because for things like the observation at endpoint assessment, you don't want to be booking an observation with the candidate when the kitchen is on a split shift and it's closed between the lunchtime rush and the evening rush. So you wouldn't want to book an observation in at that point. You would want to book it in at a time when the candidate is going to be able to demonstrate their full or as much of their competence as they are able to. So as I said a moment ago, there are going to be some endpoint assessment materials available, and they will be made available to you once you have booked your endpoint assessment activities, once you have registered your candidate for endpoint assessment with Pearson via the online system, so either Edexcel Online or QMA, depending on which systems you use. Then again, we will then release those support materials. As I said earlier, they will be generic and not necessarily related to hospitality in terms of the observations and the endpoint and the professional discussions, and the practice test materials will possibly be available on the website prior to this point, so you can get the candidates to start working through the practice tests at that point. But the majority of the support materials will be available once you've booked your endpoint test. So as I mentioned last week, or may have mentioned last week, there are actually 20% of the overall funding is actually withheld by the ESFA until the candidate has completed their endpoint assessment, not necessarily achieved, but completed the endpoint assessment. Many providers and awarding and assessment organisations initially believed that this was to pay for endpoint assessment. That actually isn't the case. You may have to pay for endpoint assessment prior to endpoint assessment actually being undertaken. So this 20% funding with withholding is akin to the achievement payments that you currently receive on SACE. So this is a completion payment more than an achievement payment. As I said, it's paid on completion of the endpoint assessment, which is the wording used in the funding guidance, at least for last year, not necessarily an achievement payment. As I mentioned earlier, obviously the EPA is the critical element. You need to ensure the candidate will pass the EPA because if they don't pass the EPA, then obviously they will not achieve and it will affect your success rates.